Hey, it's Richard Miller here with Facts for Working People. I want to say a little bit, talk a little bit today about labour stuff. I lived through the 80s when there was a bit of a movement after the crushing of PATCO, which was the Air Traffic Controllers Union, professional air traffic controllers, and Reagan crushed them, fired 11,000 of them, banned them from working in their industry for life. And of course, the leaders of the Labour movement, Kirkland at the time was the head of the AFL-CIO, did basically nothing. It gave the bosses the green light, and they went after the organised working class heavily in the 1980s. But there was an attempt, numerous attempts to drive back that offensive. We had the Hormel Strike that went on for a year, civil war basically. We had the Greyhound Strike, two of them. We had a Teamster strike, a Detroit Teamster strike. I remember pictures of the cops and the Teamsters battling it out, fisticuffs out in the streets in Detroit. So there was an attempt by some sections of the working class to organise working class to fight back and drive back the Reagan offensive. And if you take the Hormel Strike, for example, I was sort of early on in my... it was 1984, 85 when I got involved in the Central Labour Council, and they were all gung-ho supporting the Hormel P9, local P9 of Hormel, that was involved in that meat packer strike, and against the Hormel Corporation. But then the UFCW nationally, the national leadership pulled what they call strike sanction. In other words, it made the strikes a wildcat or an illegal strike. And it was eventually crushed, but it went on for a year. You had roving pickets. They went down and they picketed a plant in Fremont, Nebraska, I think it was, and of course they used the Taft-Hartley against them, but they lost that battle because they had moved production there, and I think it was considered legal. We out here in California, there was a lot of support from, but as soon as the international pulled strike sanction. All of the gung-ho delegates in the Central Labour Council, suddenly, most of them, or a lot of them certainly, were not elected. They were appointed career-type people. The communist delegates, I didn't know were communist delegates, but they were, and other lefty types all fell into line as soon as the bureaucracy abandoned these people. And anyway, we took, at my local, adopted a family from Austin, Minnesota, which is where the strike was centered. And it was a huge strike. It was defeated by that combination of the employers and the union officialdom at the highest levels. There were mistakes made, if you want to get into the question of the local leadership. But in the main, it was that the failure of the trade union leadership in general. And the reason I raise that is all through the 80s, there were some of those battles. And a friend and I were talking today about, there's a title in Lerone Bennett's book, The Shaping of Black America, I think it's called The Road Not Taken. And when you think about what began to develop in the 1980s, this movement against the capitalist offensive, it was the road not taken in terms of the people with power at the top of the labor movement. You had those two Greyhound strikes. I remember the one here in San Francisco where you had... there was an attempt to get into the Greyhound building. We surrounded the building. I remember Walter Johnson, head of 1199 at the time, I think. He went on to become the head of the Central Labour Council. He might have been at that time, but I don't think so. And dragging his foot along the sidewalk, saying this is the line in the sand. It was yet another line in the sand, and naturally the bosses crossed it, and they did nothing. And So we had that, we had the Hormel Strike and these various strikes. So there was a real movement from below to try to drive back the capitalist offensive. And along with this, we had the development of the LPA and Anthony Mazzocchi, who was an official in the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers Union, going around the country talking about the need for a Labour Party. They have two parties, we don't have any parties. I met him in Detroit. Me and Roger Martinez were there as delegates from my local, and we had invited him we asked him if we could organize a meeting in California. Would he speak at it? And he said as long as it was endorsed by a local, it was. So we got my local to endorse a meeting. We organised a meeting for him in '89. In New York, other individuals, including comrades of mine, we were in the same group together. We were called Labour Militant, the predecessor of Socialist Alternative, before we were expelled from Socialist Alternative. And so there was Mazzocchi going around calling for a Labour Party. I used to raise that all the time in my Central Labour Council and, of course, in my local. And there was a period in my local where no Democrat could get elected or endorsed or supported by my local because we were so involved in that Labour Party issue. Mazzocchi stayed at my house when he came here for a night. He moved further up into more a safer neighbourhood the next couple of days. But I took him around my workplace, introduced him to other people on the executive board, and even to my supervisor in the yard. And he told us after that meeting, I still have a video of it, that it was that meeting, the success of that meeting, although the usual left suspects were there were a number of workers at that meeting, regular rank and file workers, including those from my workplace. And he admitted to me and others after that meeting that it was that helped him form LPA, Labour Party Advocates. And then there was a conference to form a Labour Party in the mid-90s. Once some members of the bureaucracy began to support LPA, then certain delegates in the central Labour bodies and other left delegates for various socialist groups and what have you figured it was okay, and they began to speak out and become more involved in it. And because I was in my Central Labour Council and introduced those sort of resolutions many times, and the left sat there like bumps on a log. But anyway, when Stan Smith, especially of the central he was in the building trades here in San Francisco and over in the peninsula, he began to get involved in it. Other Labour officials began to get involved in it at different levels, and suddenly for the left, it became now a little safer for them to get involved in it. But anyway, that was crushed. That movement was crushed by the bureaucracy. It was sucked into the. Basically into the Democratic Party. It was they formed the Labour Party. It was it didn't run candidates. I remember going back to my workplace after the convention, and I said, "Well, they've decided not to run candidates." And guys who had supported the issue said, "But how can you have a political party that doesn't run candidates?" Well, there was an election. Clinton was running. Blah blah blah. All of that stuff, and so they helped just basically crush that, and the left helped him crush it as well, and. So there was this movement, and we were talking today, my friend and I, and really what it was the road that was not taken. It was the road that was blocked by the trade union leadership. And if you look also in '89, the reason I raised these, the Greyhound strikes were taking on a national character. Hormel had a whole setup. They were flying pickets, which were used in the 30s and prior by during the great general strikes in Minneapolis and what have you in 1934. They were taking on a national character. The Hormel Strike had food kitchens. They fed the town. They fed the strikers. The same with the Greyhound was taking on a national character. You had in Pittston, Pennsylvania, you had that coal strike in 1989, 1990, went from about the early part of '89 to the early part of 1990, about 10 months. That had about 37,000 wildcatters in it at one time. It was a UMW strike. Trumka was the head of it, who is now the head of the AFL-CIO. And that strike was a huge strike. There was at one point they occupied the strike there. About 99 or 100 UMW members went in and occupied one of the plants there. And that lasted 3 days, and they came out. Trumka helped get them out of there. But there was a huge support for this strike. You had, when they occupied that plant, I think it was called the Moss 3 plant, you had... it was one of the coal processing plants. You had 100 or so inside. You had, and I think they were wearing fatigues. You had about 5 or 7 or 8,000 outside. You had Camp Solidarity, which was a recreational area, a park that was taken over by workers and their supporters and their families to feed people, house people, because the local residents didn't have enough places to house people. But anyway, Trumka, the Labour bureaucracy, pulled them out of there, didn't spread it further, and that strike didn't ended the way it did. I know the union was fined. I haven't, done research this or gone back to look over it. I'm running from memory here, but they were fined. The union was fined about $60 million. The trade union officials were fined, but there was no, meekness breeds aggression, and by being meek. Even I think when Pittston, some years later, the coal company dropped all the charges, the court still went after the union and the union officials. I don't recall how it ended up, but there were serious attempts. Staley, there was also a fight there in a big strike in Decatur, Illinois, where the whole town was involved in that. There were these huge developments in the 1980s to throw back the capitalist offensive. And so we were thinking, in a way, that was the road that was never taken. In my own union, AFSCME, we'd published a opposition bulletin called the AFSCME Activist. And in '96, I was in the group, the Socialist Alternatives predecessor, Labour militant at the time. If you look on WikiLeaks and look at Socialist Alternative, that history is hidden. It's like the Stalinists, they've hidden that history, despite the fact that the CWI, to which the Socialist Alternative is affiliated, and to which we were affiliated as Labour militant at the time, led a strike here in my workplace, my union. We formed, when I was in the group, before we were expelled from that group, the AFSCME Activist, which was a rank and file newsletter that was supported by about 10 unions in different states, a number of individuals, a lot of women involved in it, because AFSCME is fairly high. It was over 50% women at that time, certainly. And in 1996, we decided it was the time, because they would send me articles, and I'd put that together. I'm no genius on the computer or this type of stuff, as you probably know. Then I would send it out. My union, Local 444, AFSCME Local 444, gave me a little bit of seed money. I think it was $500 or something like that. Helped me start it off. I got great support from Anne Habel, who was a dishwasher at the University of Madison. I still know her to this day. Her and her husband were activists in AFSCME. From people down in Arizona, women that were dispatchers for the I think they worked for the city as dispatchers, and Minnesota, Hawaii. The AFSCME activists got a lot of support, and we decided that we wanted to. The time was right. We'd started it as a project of Labour militant to build a united front within AFSCME. And we were in the leadership of that united front. We figured just in terms of the newsletter, but we could lose it, whatever. But it was a united front, and it was very successful. And in 1996, we decided we would vote for it. We would have an editorial board so people could start to take more active control of it, rather than just sending me the articles and have me do that, but to beginnings of a real living caucus within, I think, what was the fastest growing union of the time at that period. And so we did that. To cut a long story short, I was expelled for doing that by Socialist Alternative's predecessor, because they then decided, the leadership of that organisation, that it was not a united front, it was their organisation, and I was violating democratic centralism. But the point... The sad thing about that was there was a crisis in AFSCME that followed that, where they were stuffing ballots. It was in New York when the Teamsters, also the teachers under Feldman, the rank and file had rejected contracts. AFSCME was voting on the same sort of similar contracts, and there was a great opportunity. It would have been a great opportunity for a genuine opposition, a united front within AFSCME at that time that was wrecked by the CWI the people that run Socialist Alternative now. But the point was thinking about, and the point we raised talking about the road never not taken, is that what that did, and what the Labour leadership does, is that they opened the door to this garbage we see now, to Trump, to the crisis we have. I sat with an old fella that I know last night. He's a Republican guy, decent guy. Never before in his life has he not voted. He can't vote. He said he's an older guy, and he said they can't pick a candidate. We can't have a candidate that the American people can support. I mean, it's unprecedented what we're seeing happening, and the prime blame, dominant blame for this lies with the trade union leadership. A member of a left group not so long ago said to me, "You have a principle of attacking the Labour leadership." No, we don't, and no, I don't. But the question is, you've got to point to where the responsibility lies. Is their behaviour over the last 25, their positions, their policies, the idea of the team concept have led and have opened the door for the likes of Trump, has not provided an alternative. Somebody was blaming me as I'm voting for Jill Stein for president. Somebody was attacking me for opening the door for Hillary. All the same arguments you hear. The Green Party is going to be responsible for this and that and the other. No, the prominent responsibility, the blame for the crisis we have in politics is the trade union leadership, because they have allowed, and their failure to offer an alternative has opened these doors. And so we see lunatics, and he is an unstable individual. He's not like your traditional right-wing racist and misogynist right-winger. He is a lunatic and unstable, and who knows what will happen, as we pointed out afterwards, the election, either some sort of a right formation or a right-wing party, possibly not led by him, but those around him, the Breitbart characters and Bannon. We don't know enough about them. But the main point I just wanted to mention today was, especially for young people, those strikes. I mean, you can't imagine, a lot of young people can't, I mean, imagine that situation at Pittston. Thousands and thousands of people that were out in support of that strike. The same in Hormel and everything else. These opportunities arose, they were squashed and blocked by the trade union movement, the leaders of the trade union movement. And the same goes for the political question, an alternative political party. So I guess you can hear the phone ringing in the background, forgot to shut it off, and that's all for today. See you next time.